Among the most cherished delusions of advanced galactic civilization was the belief that evolution naturally progressed toward peaceful enlightenment. The Galactic Concordat had spent 3 millennia perfecting their society, eliminating every trace of what they deemed barbaric impulses. Their cities floated serenely above peaceful worlds, where the most aggressive behavior involved heated debates about the proper shade of purple for civic monuments. The Concordat's member species had achieved this enlightened state through various means, each more sophisticated than the last. The Crystalline Collective had transcended physical violence by evolving beyond physical form entirely, existing as pure thought patterns that debated philosophy through harmonic resonances. The Ethereal Council had eliminated aggression by developing empathic abilities so refined that causing distress to another being caused equivalent suffering to themselves. The Aquatic Federation had solved conflict through collective decision-making processes that required unanimous consent for any action more aggressive than gentle water displacement. It was a galaxy where the concept of military force existed only in historical archives, filed under primitive curiosities alongside such quaint notions as territorial disputes and resource competition. War was something that happened to species too intellectually undeveloped to discover proper meditation techniques. Violence was a symptom of evolutionary immaturity that enlightened beings had outgrown, sometime around the development of faster-than-light travel. This carefully constructed philosophy of universal pacifism had worked remarkably well for creating a stable, peaceful galactic society. It had also, as they were about to discover, left them spectacularly unprepared for dealing with species that had taken alternative evolutionary paths. Into this perfectly manicured garden of cosmic civilization had stumbled humanity, with all the grace of a caffeinated rhinoceros in a meditation retreat. The humans had somehow managed to develop faster-than-light travel while still maintaining quaint traditions like contact sports, competitive eating, and the inexplicable urge to climb mountains, simply because they existed. The Concordat's first mistake was assuming they could domesticate these curious bipeds through exposure to proper society. Their second mistake was appointing a human as their liaison to the Zephian Empire during the most delicate peace negotiations in galactic history. The human diplomat possessed credentials that looked impressive on crystalline data tablets, multiple degrees in xenopolitics, fluency in 47 galactic languages, and a recommendation praising her innovative approach to interspecies relations. What the recommendation failed to mention was her background in what humans euphemistically called conflict resolution. Her previous assignments had included negotiating mining rights with species whose idea of contract discussion involved ritual combat, mediating territorial disputes between hive minds that communicated through aggressive pheromone releases, and successfully preventing 3 separate incidents that had threatened to escalate into what humans casually referred to as interplanetary misunderstandings. In human diplomatic circles, she was considered a specialist in challenging assignments, a euphemism that roughly translated to situations where someone might need to demonstrate why humans had originally achieved space travel by strapping themselves to controlled explosions and hoping for the best. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, represented the logical extreme of evolutionary pacifism. They were a species that had evolved from prey animals on a world where the primary survival strategy involved looking as non-threatening as possible while slowly backing away from anything that might eat them. Their ancestors had been small, herbivorous creatures whose greatest evolutionary achievement had been developing the ability to apologize preemptively to predators. Over millions of years, this had evolved into a complex civilization based entirely on avoiding any situation that might result in conflict, confrontation, or even mild disagreement. Their entire governmental structure was built around the concept of perpetual apology. Their constitution was essentially a document expressing regret for existing and promising to cause as little inconvenience as possible to other species. Their diplomatic protocol involved increasingly elaborate demonstrations of submission designed to convince potential threats that they posed absolutely no danger to anyone or anything. The negotiations had been proceeding with glacial pace. Representatives from 12 species sat in perfect circle, creating a symphony of polite discourse. The Ethereal Collective hummed harmoniously. The Silicon Collective pulsed with soft lights. The The Aquatic Federation bubbled gently. Then the human diplomat made her contribution to galactic peace. When the Zephyrian ambassador released what their cultural attaché described as a particularly complex pheromone combination expressing deep concern about territorial boundaries while maintaining utmost respect for all parties, the human's response bypassed 3,000 years of diplomatic protocol entirely. She laughed, not the gentle, tinkling sound that passed for amusement among civilized species, but the full-throated, unrestrained laughter of a species that found humor in their own mortality. The sound caused the Zephyrian delegation to immediately assume defensive postures their ancestors had perfected when facing predators, but the human wasn't finished. She stood up. Sudden vertical movement during negotiations was considered barely contained aggression in civilized society. "Look," she said, her voice carrying that particular human quality suggesting she was about to solve everyone's problems, whether they wanted her to or not. "Maybe we're overthinking this. Simple solution. Establish a joint defense force. Problem solved." The silence that followed was typically reserved for contemplating the heat death of the universe. The concept of a defense force was so fundamentally alien to Concordat thinking that their translation matrices began overheating. The Zephyrian ambassador released a pheromone cloud that roughly translated to, "The scary predator wants to organize other scary predators, and now I'm going to die," the human continued with enthusiasm. "We could start with patrol routes, maybe some early warning systems, nothing fancy, just basic deterrent strategies." Each word violated civilized discourse. The breaking point came when she gestured while speaking, rapid movement of appendages that could theoretically be used as weapons. The Zephyrian delegation collectively fainted. The aftermath was swift. Within hours, the Concordat's council had convened emergency session. The charges against the human diplomat were read in 17 different languages, each translation somehow managing to make her crimes sound worse than the original. Disturbing the peace through aggressive vocalization, proposing solutions involving organized violence, causing mass psychological trauma to a protected species, displaying predatory behavioral patterns during sacred diplomatic proceedings, introducing concepts of militaristic organization to a peaceful gathering, contaminating civilized discourse with primitive survival strategies. The Concordat's legal scholars, beings who had spent centuries perfecting the art of conflict resolution through proper committee formation and meditation, found themselves dealing with violations that didn't fit into their carefully categorized legal framework. The human had committed crimes that their legal system hadn't anticipated because no civilized being had ever thought to commit them. The deliberations that followed were conducted with the kind of solemn gravity typically reserved for cosmic catastrophes. Representatives from each member species contributed their own cultural perspectives on appropriate punishment for someone who had demonstrated such fundamental disregard for the principles of enlightened civilization. The crystalline collective suggested enforced meditation until the human achieved proper philosophical awareness. The ethereal council recommended empathic conditioning to help her understand the emotional damage she had caused. The Aquatic Federation proposed immersion therapy in environments designed to promote peaceful contemplation. Exile to Kethmara, a world so dangerous that archives contained only warnings about it. A planet where evolution had apparently held a contest for most creative ways to kill things and forgotten to declare a winner. The council settled back into harmonious deliberations, confident they had solved the human problem. After all, what could one primitive biped do against a world full of apex predators? They were about to find out exactly how spectacularly wrong a civilized species could be. The transport ship maintained respectful distance from Kethmara's surface, its crew having no desire to linger in what they considered a cosmic disposal unit. Through viewing ports, the world below looked like someone had taken a normal planet and asked nightmare designers to suggest improvements. Kethmara's continents were painted in crimson and burnt orange, vast rock expanses broken by glowing chasms. The oceans were murky brown, suggesting more interesting chemicals than standard hydrogen-oxygen combinations. Atmospheric readings were masterpieces of hostility, oxygen levels that would make most species lightheaded, gravity equivalent to being permanently hugged by an enthusiastic gorilla, and weather patterns including seasonal acid rain. The human reviewed these readings with casual interest, calculating wind patterns and identifying shelter locations. "Lovely," she muttered, watching a lightning storm form. "Looks like the weather's going to be exciting." The Concordat observers expected to witness a brief educational display of how quickly an unprotected biped would succumb to a world that had never heard of mercy. The exile pod's descent through Kethmara's atmosphere provided the human with her first comprehensive view of what the Concordat had intended to be her tomb. The planet's surface revealed itself in layers of increasingly creative hostility. Vast crystalline formations that hummed with stored electromagnetic energy created natural lightning farms across the continents. Forests of what appeared to be vegetation moved with predatory patience, their root systems forming underground networks that suggested collective intelligence with territorial inclinations. The atmospheric composition readings were particularly educational. The oxygen content was roughly 30% higher than most species considered safe, creating an environment where fires burned hotter, chemical reactions proceeded faster, and metabolisms operated at accelerated rates. The gravity was approximately 1.3 standard units, enough to make every movement more challenging without being immediately crushing. Most interesting of all, the atmospheric pressure variations created weather patterns that included phenomena the pod's sensors could only classify as meteorological hostility events. As the pod settled into what its navigation systems optimistically designated as a landing zone, the human took a moment to appreciate the irony of her situation. The Concordat had chosen this world specifically because its ecosystem was so dangerous that no civilized species could survive on its surface. What they had failed to consider was that humans had originally developed on a world where the primary survival strategy had been becoming more dangerous than everything else trying to kill them. The pod's external sensors immediately began cataloging the local wildlife with the efficiency of equipment designed for xenobiological research. The readings that scrolled across her display screens would have sent most Concordat observers into immediate panic. Predator density, extreme. Average size of local fauna, significantly larger than recommended for survival scenarios. Apparent intelligence level of apex predators, concerningly high. Estimated survival time for unprotected standard humanoid, less than 6 hours. The human reviewed these statistics with the professional interest of someone who had been trained to find opportunities in situations that others might classify as impossible. 6 hours was actually longer than she had been given on her previous assignment to negotiate with the Keltharian hive, and she had successfully concluded those discussions with a mutual cooperation agreement and only minimal casualties. The first locals were Kethmaran stalkers, creatures the size of small shuttles with 6 legs ending in material-rending claws and sensory organs detecting heartbeats from kilometers away. They approached with confidence born of never encountering anything they couldn't efficiently dismember. The human's response to being surrounded by 6 perfect killing machines was to sit down, a decision that represented either supreme confidence or complete psychological breakdown. The stalkers, whose hunting algorithms had been perfected through millions of years of successful predation, found themselves dealing with something entirely outside their evolutionary experience. Prey animals were supposed to follow predictable behavioral patterns. They either ran, which triggered pursuit instincts and led to efficient chase and kill sequences, or they fought, which activated combat protocols and resulted in brief, violent conclusions. Some prey species attempted to hide, which simply meant the hunt took longer, but ended with the same satisfying outcome. A few tried to appear threatening through various display behaviors, which the stalkers found amusing but ultimately ineffective. But this creature had done none of those things. Instead, it had positioned itself strategically against the crystal formations, eliminating their ability to attack from all directions simultaneously, and was now engaged in what appeared to be patient observation. The human was studying them with the kind of focused attention that suggested professional interest rather than fear. This behavioral anomaly created something approaching cognitive dissonance in creatures whose entire existence revolved around the elegant simplicity of predator-prey relationships. The stalkers began to suspect they might be dealing with something that didn't fit into their traditional categories of food, rival predator, or territorial threat. The pack leader, whose extensive scarring told the story of decades of successful hunts, approached with the cautious steps of a creature that had suddenly realized it might be operating with incomplete information. The human watched its approach with the calm attention of someone reading an interesting but not particularly urgent message, showing none of the physiological stress responses that typically preceded predation events. When the stalker was close enough to detect individual heartbeats, muscle tension, and hormonal fluctuations, the readings it received were even more confusing. The human's cardiovascular system was elevated but stable, suggesting alertness rather than panic. Her breathing patterns indicated controlled awareness rather than fear. Most puzzling of all, her biochemical signature included none of the stress hormones that normally flooded prey animals' systems when confronted with imminent death. Magnificent creatures, apex predators perfectly adapted to your environment. I respect that. Her response to the stalker's threatening rumble was to produce a protein ration and offer a piece to the pack leader with casual pigeon-feeding gestures. The stalker's sensory organs detected proteins it had never encountered, preservatives that didn't exist in nature, and industrial flavoring agents. The combination was so alien that its predatory programming essentially crashed. More creatures gathered, drawn by curiosity about the strange arrival that didn't understand it was supposed to be running or dying. Flying predators circled overhead, their wingspans creating historically fatal shadows. Burrowing hunters emerged from tunnels, their sonar painting pictures of potential prey that behaved like nothing in evolutionary experience. The human, surrounded by enough concentrated lethality to depopulate a small moon, pulled out a portable shelter and began setting up camp. As twin suns set, painting the sky in atmospheric burning shades, the human completed camp setup and began preparing dinner. The assembled predators, now numbering dozens, watched with fascination as something challenged every food chain assumption they possessed. The human looked up at her audience, smiled with casual friendliness that had historically preceded humanity's most catastrophic diplomatic incidents, and made an observation that would have sent the Concordat Council into emergency session. You know what? I think I'm going to like it here. The apex predators of Kethmara began suspecting they had encountered something that outranked them in previously unconsidered ways. 3 months into what the Concordat had confidently labeled Project Primitive Elimination, their long-range sensors began detecting anomalies that challenged fundamental principles of xenobiology, physics, and common sense. Kethmara's ecosystem, which had maintained a stable equilibrium of mutual predation and creative violence for approximately 4 million years, was undergoing what their scientists carefully termed unprecedented organizational restructuring. The human had not only failed to die but appeared to be conducting what could only be described as a masterclass in applied apex predator management. The xenobiologists monitoring the situation from their safe distance found themselves observing patterns that made their carefully constructed theories about predator-prey relationships curl up in corners and whimper. The changes had begun subtly, with minor alterations in territorial behavior among the planet's major predator species. The Kethmaran stalkers, who had historically maintained hunting territories through a combination of violence and intimidation, had begun demonstrating what appeared to be coordinated defensive behaviors. Instead of competing with each other for optimal hunting grounds, they had established what could only be described as a perimeter defense system around the human's expanding area of influence. This was the first clear indication that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the Concordat's execution plan. Stalkers were solitary predators by evolutionary design, creatures whose success depended on avoiding interaction with their own species except during brief mating encounters that typically involved as much violence as reproduction. The concept of cooperative territorial defense was so alien to their nature that xenobiologists initially assumed their equipment was malfunctioning, but the evidence continued to accumulate. The Sky Reapers, aerial predators, whose hunting strategy had historically involved solitary attacks from high altitude, had begun demonstrating flight patterns that suggested coordinated reconnaissance activities. The creatures that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of individual predation were now functioning as components of a larger organizational structure. The pack leader's new scars suggested successful territorial disputes with other predatory species. The human's influence spread like virulent infection, Except, instead of causing fever, it caused wholesale reorganization of predatory hierarchies. Sky Reapers began performing patrol flights around expanding territory. Creatures that had been individual apex predators now functioned as reconnaissance units for something higher up the food chain, a bipedal mammal with survival kit and attitude problem. Underground tunnel hunters created extensive protected passage networks. The human could travel across continents without surface exposure, courtesy of predators that had historically considered surface dwelling and food source synonymous. But the most significant development, the one that made Concordat observers begin questioning their understanding of evolutionary biology itself, was the systematic reorganization of predatory hierarchies across the entire planet. Species that had historically been apex predators in their respective ecological niches were now demonstrating subordinate behaviors towards something that occupied a position higher up a food chain that shouldn't have existed. The tunnel hunters had begun creating what appeared to be an extensive underground transportation network connecting the humans' territory to resource-rich areas across multiple continents. These weren't hunting tunnels designed for ambush predation, but infrastructure projects that suggested long-term planning and resource allocation strategies. The creatures that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of solitary underground hunting were now functioning as a construction and logistics force. Most disturbing of all was the arrival of the dread Moors, creatures that represented the absolute pinnacle of Kethmara's evolutionary arms race. These beings had achieved such complete predatory dominance that they had no natural enemies, no territorial competitors, and no evolutionary pressure to develop anything resembling social cooperation. They were living embodiments of perfect lethality, solitary hunters whose very existence had shaped the behavioral patterns of every other species on the planet. Dread Moors were the reason that other apex predators maintained such carefully defined territorial boundaries. They were the invisible presence that kept aggressive species from becoming too aggressive, the ultimate regulatory force that ensured no single predator species could achieve complete dominance over Kethmara's ecosystem. Their hunting range encompassed entire continents, and their presence in any area immediately redefined the local food chain around, avoiding them at all costs. The fact that 3 mature Dreadmoors had taken up permanent residence around the human's territory represented a violation of natural law so fundamental that Concordat xenobiologists began questioning whether their basic understanding of predator behavior had been completely wrong from the beginning. According to every interspecies relations principle, the human should have been consumed within seconds. Dread Moors didn't form social bonds, demonstrate protective behaviors, or engage in territorial cooperation, except they did now. The human had established herself as apex of apex predators through communication methods transcending traditional xenobiology. She wasn't dominating through violence, but communicating with creatures incapable of complex communication, forming alliances with species incapable of alliance formation. The breaking point came when sensors detected an interspecies conference. Representatives from every major predator species had gathered in neutral territory. Stalkers sat beside tunnel hunters, Sky Reapers perched, while Dreadmoors coiled in relaxed poses. The gathering had business meeting atmosphere rather than expected massacre. The human stood center stage, gesturing with casual confidence while explaining concepts to intelligent students. Translation equipment captured fragments of strategic planning sessions, territory allocation discussions, resource management protocols, coordinated response strategies. The human wasn't just surviving on Kethmara, she was organizing it. The final evidence that the Concordat's execution plan had achieved results precisely opposite to their intentions came when their long-range sensors detected something approaching from the outer system. A ship broadcasting identification codes that marked it as belonging to a Sicarian raiding fleet. The vessel had apparently decided that Kethmara's resources were worth the risk of approaching a world that galactic charts marked with warnings that essentially translated to "abandon hope, all ye who enter here." This development presented the Concordat observers with an unexpected opportunity to witness exactly how their exiled human would respond to a genuine external threat. Their scientific curiosity, despite being tempered by growing concern about the implications of what they were observing, compelled them to maintain their monitoring position and document what they assumed would be the humans' final moments. As the planet's apex predators encountered professional military forces, the Sicarians represented a completely different category of threat than anything the human had previously encountered on Kithmara. While the planet's native predators were dangerous, they operated according to biological imperatives and evolutionary programming that could be understood and potentially influenced. The Sicarian raiders were intelligent, organized, and equipped with technology specifically designed for overwhelming and subjugating populations. They represented the kind of systematic, coordinated threat that had historically required military responses from organized civilizations. The humans' response was calling a staff meeting. Within hours, apex predators assembled in formations, demonstrating tactical thinking that made military strategists question intelligence definitions. Sky Reapers took optimal attack positions, stalker packs established kill zones, tunnel hunters prepared underground engagement points, while dreadmaws positioned as mobile response units. Kethmara had been reorganized from death world too dangerous for civilized species into something too dangerous for uncivilized species. The human, commanding coordinated lethality, made an observation. Sensors recorded despite interference from multiple species expressing violence anticipation. Well, this should be educational. The Sicarian raiders were about to discover that Kethmara's apex predator wasn't any magnificent evolved creature, but the one who'd arrived 3 months ago, with basic survival kit and apparent talent for career advancement. The Sicarian raiding fleet approached Kethmara with the confidence born from turning aggressive resource acquisition into an art form perfected across dozens of successful campaigns. Their ships represented the cutting edge of predatory technology, sleek vessels designed for rapid insertion, overwhelming firepower, and faster extraction. The crews were professionals who had honed their skills on worlds across 3 galactic sectors, beings who had made careers out of taking what they wanted from species too weak or too civilized to stop them. Their tactical assessment of Kethmara was thorough and professionally executed, following standard operating procedures that had proven successful on countless previous raids. Orbital scans revealed a planet rich in exotic minerals, populated by wildlife that would command premium prices in the illegal exotic pet trade, and apparently lacking any intelligent species capable of organized resistance. The combination was exactly what Sicarian raiders looked for: maximum profit potential with minimal risk of encountering organized opposition. What their scans failed to detect, because their equipment was designed to identify technological threats rather than biological ones, was that the planet's apex predators had spent the last 3 months attending what amounted to a comprehensive graduate program in applied military strategy, taught by an instructor whose species had refined the art of warfare through several thousand years of enthusiastic practice against increasingly creative opponents. The raiders' confidence was further reinforced by their previous experiences with death worlds. Dangerous wildlife was a known variable in their operational planning, something that could be managed through superior firepower and appropriate tactical protocols. They had encountered aggressive fauna before and had developed effective techniques for dealing with creatures that relied purely on instinct and individual predatory capabilities. The first indication of complications came when their scout ship discovered local wildlife had opinions about uninvited visitors. Sky Reapers emerged in coordinated formations, executing attack patterns suggesting familiarity with aerospace combat principles. The pilot's final transmission consisted mainly of confused profanity before systematic disabling by creatures understanding strategic targeting. The main fleet, receiving reports of wildlife using military tactics, assumed equipment malfunction. Wildlife didn't coordinate, predators didn't strategize, creatures unfamiliar with technology certainly didn't understand systematic disabling. Their assumption lasted 18 minutes after landing. Stalker packs had practiced urban warfare principles despite Kethmara having no cities. They used terrain for concealment, coordinated psychological impact attacks, and employed natural stealth beyond simple hunting. Sicarian ground forces found themselves facing enemies combining trained soldiers' tactical thinking with apex predators' physical capabilities. The first raiding party lasted 7 minutes before retreat became rout. The commander's report, stripped of colorful military language, boiled down to, "The wildlife is cheating." Tunnel hunters learned military applications of natural burrowing, creating networks allowing appearance behind enemy positions. Dreadmore's discovered coordinated multi-predator attacks could overwhelm well-armed opponents. Most unsettling was discovering wildlife receiving real-time tactical coordination from command structure. The human conducted live-action tactical exercises with students whose natural abilities exceeded professional military units, communicating through adapted signals for each species' systems. The result was defense networks responding to battlefield conditions with professional adaptability and evolved ferocity. The fleet commander, reviewing coordinated multi-CK apex predator reports, chose discretion over continued existence. The fleet began immediate withdrawal preparations, abandoning advanced forces with ruthless Sicarian pragmatism. Except the human had anticipated this. Sky Reapers, functioning as aerospace defense, positioned to intercept departing vessels. They learned coordinated formations overwhelming individual ships, and strategic thinking about attack purposes, disabling rather than destroying, capturing rather than killing, sending messages to potential threats. The final insult came via communication from planet's surface. The human thanked raiders for providing excellent training exercises, expressed regret about shortened visits, and suggested updating navigational charts reflecting Kethmara's restricted system status. She mentioned casually that future uninvited visitors might find wildlife less accommodating. The Concordat observers found themselves dealing with situations challenging every primitive species assumption. The exiled human had established supreme authority over apex predator worlds, organizing perfect individual killers into coordinated defense forces overwhelming professional military units. In 3 months, implications were staggering. If one human achieved this influence, what could humanity accomplish if they decided galactic power structures needed adjustment? The Concordat Council convened emergency sessions, concluding their exiled judgment had been premature. They composed carefully worded communications, expressing renegotiation desires and return possibilities. The human's response was brief, polite consideration. She thanked them for renewed diplomatic interest, expressed appreciation for welfare concerns, and mentioned considering proposals after finishing administrative tasks related to her current position. Her current position involved serving as Supreme Coordinator of Kethmara's Apex Predator Alliance, with responsibilities requiring proper succession planning. She also mentioned, with casual friendliness, historically preceding significant diplomatic developments, discussing interstellar expansion concepts with associates very interested in cultural exchange opportunities. The Concordat Council, suddenly facing militarized apex predator death worlds developing galactic exploration interests under human leadership, discovered their civilized behavior understanding needed fundamental revisions. In attempting to eliminate primitive threats, they had inadvertently created something redefining threat concepts entirely. The human, standing on her intended tomb world, surrounded by apex predators considering her their goddess, looked at stars with expressions suggesting promising career turns. After all, if she could organize one death world, imagine accomplishing with a few more.